Hello, Lee. It's so good to see you on here. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Oh, no
And
problem. It's good to see you, Calahn.
oh, thank you. Yeah, and for everyone who's tuning in, this is Lee Morgan, and he is one of our instructors at the Blackthorne School. And he has a course coming up called the Great Initiator. And Lee has so generously offered to answer a few questions I have about the course and also just give a few little insights about his practice. So, uh, to start out, Lee, can you tell me just a little bit about your background and help familiarize anyone not up to date about you and your work? What current do you work in and what are your influences?
Okay. Well, I've trained in a couple of different streams of practices classing themselves as traditional witchcraft.
Hmm.
Both of them were quite different. One of them was like a in-person sort of training, and the other was more of a distance influence. I feel like the kind of craft that I practice today is a result of a couple of different things. I mean, of course, especially that early training in traditional craft has had a strong effect on me. And I probably still lean in the direction of, seeing it as something which is based on having obligations to a sort of a clan-like kind of structure around you and
Mm,
everything like that. I'm also
okay.
really influenced by Rosalind Norton's practice as well, and I've had some connection with people that, are carrying on her work in the world. I suppose
Wonderful.
those would be the main things that I would bring up. I mean, I've also come from quite a superstitious family and everything, which probably helps in a way.
Absolutely. What's one superstition that comes to mind from your family?
Well, when my nan would ever drop a knife in the house, she would always say that a gentleman was coming to call after that. And even though it's a very simple thing, she was often right about that. I don't know whether she just had a lot of gentleman callers or whether the superstition has some value.
One can dream.
Just throwing knives down. Mm,
Ugh. So, kind of circling back to the class,
mm,
and I'm asking some questions that maybe I know the answers to, but I want to make sure that everyone is on board and understanding things. And, anyone that maybe isn't as experienced can get a feel for what we're talking about here. So I'm going to
mhm.
ask a few questions that are a little more basic and then some that are more in depth. But could you explain to our viewers what is necromancy exactly, which is the big topic of your upcoming course? And it's,
Mm.
necromancy sounds so spooky to those new to the idea. How would you explain it in both a basic sense and to a more accomplished practitioner?
Well, originally necromancy at its most literal definition was probably something to do with actually working with the dead body of the deceased person and the belief that they could be made to speak or utter prophecies and things like that. But over time, it's picked up a much more broad sort of definition for magic that works with the dead more broadly. I specifically allocate this course as being folk necromancy, which is my way of saying that it's not based off extremely complex conjurations or grimoire material,
Mm.
but it draws on folk practices that have traditionally been used to enhance our ability to communicate with the dead. That can be for a number of purposes. It can be something as quite palatable and widely accepted as ancestor work, which people do to
Mhm.
clear blockages in their life and stuff like that. Or it can be everything from a familiar of a dead person working with you to achieve a magical goal, or even, and I touch on that in the course, like a mystical insight into the actual experience of death which can sometimes have great mental health benefits for people
Mhm.
who might be feeling fear or grief.
Yeah, that sounds like really important work.
Well, yeah, I think it is, and it's quite broad work too that could fulfill a lot
Mhm.
of purposes for different people depending what they're looking for.
Absolutely. What drew you to studying necromancy and how to work with death and the dead?
Well, personal experiences, I suppose.
Mhm.
From round about, my puberty years, I started to have dreams and then occasionally waking experiences or liminal experiences with people that I took to be spirits of deceased people. And, you know, early on, I began to sort of lean into whatever the conditions were that were present at the time that had caused that to happen to see if I could repeat that. And, you know, I think that led me in the direction of witchcraft. Um, and, I've been applying techniques from the craft to sort of enhance that, but I also have a really keen interest in folklore in general.
Mm,
So I've sort of just been acquiring tips and tricks and things for many years now that help me to get into the state where I have those experiences.
yes. So you started out with this fundamental capacity for these experiences, but there's a lot of work that you've probably done to really hone and direct those experiences in a way that's helpful for you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely. I mean, I could have been just frightened of it and not done anything with it and tried to block it. But I really feel I've got a lot out of leaning into these practices.
Yeah. That's wonderful. Can you say a bit about the connection between the fairy faith and necromantic work?
A little bit, yes. I think that there's a strong crossover zone for a couple of reasons between these two topics. For instance, the good folk were believed to sometimes take humans or take the spirit of a dead human into their world, and that through some mysterious change that would happen to them, that person would then be converted into a being that had certain powers to share that were different to that of the normal dead. So
Mhm.
there is like that sort of gray area. Plus, there is a large contingency of people that believe that fairy themselves are simply the spirits of very ancient, dead, and evolved humans. I don't necessarily, subscribe to that idea
Mhm.
myself, but I do think that there is definitely a class of beings, shall we say, that fit both categories of
Yeah.
things.
Mhm. Thank you for that insight. Um, I mentioned the spooky quality for for some people that comes up surrounding this work. Do you find the work to be dangerous at all? How do you protect yourself doing this work while maintaining your effectiveness? And have you had any close
Mm,
calls?
it's a good question. And I think people's mileage varies a great deal on that topic because there are some people that I do think it is dangerous for.
Mhm.
Whereas in my own experience, I would say I've certainly had some uncomfortable experiences. But I've had more harm done to me by living humans than I have by dead humans over the years, easily.
Oh,
Um,
that's
I
relatable.
think
Yes.
I think a lot of the sort of fear factor that we have around this is more to do with fear of our own mortality and the things that generate us to think more about our own mortality. And I think
Mhm.
people that go into it who are afraid of it, or do have sort of pre-existing, like serious pre-existing issues with anxiety and things like that, can end up in a bit of a snowballing situation where something spooks them and then it's like a runaway horse kind of thing, and it takes
Mhm.
on power the more that the person is afraid. And
Right.
do certainly think that there are sensible measures to protect yourself, and I do, you know, sort of check in with that and with the students
Mhm.
throughout the course about like, because I think the most important question to ask them is how are they feeling when they're doing the work, because there is a natural and a productive amount of fear that you feel when you go into a graveyard at night or something like that. I mean, to be honest,
Absolutely.
most of the fear I feel once again is of living people being in the graveyard. But still, there is a little sort of zing that you get from the power that is in that place, and
Mhm.
I think that's important and part of the work that you're able to feel that. Um, but if you, there's a sort of watching your own emotional responses is really important. I think if you get to the point where you actually like your palms are sweating and you're actually having like a strong physiological fear response, it's probably best to pull out of that working. And I found that the times I've had what I would class as intense experiences that sort of they didn't hurt me, but they certainly put the wind up me a little bit, have
Mhm.
usually been like pushed in and leaned into that feeling, which is not always bad, I think, but there's a time as with experience where you know the difference. Um, and of course, there's, a whole myriad of different folk practices that are warding procedures to make sure you don't bring things home with you that you don't want to, and that sort of
Absolutely.
thing.
And you
Mm.
cover those things in your class.
I do, yeah. And also, a lot of the time, I cover them in sort of personal discussion with the students on the page
Mhm.
because everybody's experience is different and people are
Mhm.
starting from different levels of vulnerability as well,
Mhm.
depending on their experience, and even physical health and stuff like that can make a person feel more vulnerable.
Mhm.
Like if they're at a place with that strong death current.
Okay. Yeah. How has this working with necromancy, affected your life and your practice?
I feel it has affected my life in a very positive way, and it really
Mm.
helps me when dealing with actual death. I think is something that's come up for me lately because we've had a death recently in our circle,
Mm.
not
Oh
directly,
no.
but yeah, family of family.
Yeah.
Um, and it gave me a chance to really reflect on how there's a certain calmness that you can radiate in the presence of that when you work with necromancy. Like
Mm.
your own lack of fear of death is
Mhm.
contagious to other people, and there's definitely like just a very practical human benefit in that
Mhm.
regard. But of course, also
Absolutely.
much more, bigger mystical level kind of things in the sense of feeling you've deepened your understanding of the post death state. And of course, also, powerful familiar spirits that have helped me obtain practical goals in life
Mhm.
as well. So there's kind of both human, bigger picture, and practical getting things done benefits in my
Mhm.
life, I would say.
Okay. That's wonderful. And I mean, I,
Mm,
I feel like the true gauge of whether any practice is effective is just looking at how is my overall life going now that I've embarked on this
yeah,
practice. And I mean, that's
exactly.
not to say that, like I know after certain initiatory experiences I've had, maybe my life kind of had to be deconstructed to be reconstructed. But, over the course of, say, a year or so, is my life significantly better than when I started? I mean, that's a huge question I ask myself. And
Mm,
think,
yeah,
hmm
I think so too. I think it's an important one, very important touchstone. Because I've been practicing this for so many years, though, because starting kind of at that practical but casual level in my teens, I've been doing necromancy for quite a few decades
mm,
now. It's kind of harder to measure how has it improved my life because it's been with me for most of my adult life.
hmm
But certainly, I think that as I'm getting older and I'm launching into my 40s and having people from our parental generation pass away, and stuff like that. I think it's helped me in how I deal with aging and approaching, the autumn years in my own life as well. I can definitely see
Yeah.
that. Mm.
Yeah, that's very understandable.
Mm.
Um, what sort of person do you think is an ideal candidate to practice necromancy? I know I've read some authors on the subject who have advised a specific personality type or even air about a person required to do this
Mm.
work. But what are your thoughts? What kind of skill set is required? And is there any particular level of awareness or cautions that you would advise having before embarking on the path for a potential student?
Uh, Probably. I mean, I think that the things that indicate someone would be able to do necromancy are the same things that indicate that someone is going to be able to do witchcraft. I think that they are.
Mhm,
I believe the same thing about necromancy that I do about witchcraft. That some people have a natural inclination to these things. It doesn't mean that you can't improve where you find yourself or learn through practice, but I do think there are definitely some people for whom it is easier. But I would never want to discount someone on the basis of that. I kind of think you have a go. If it has bad results for you, pull out. I'm very
yeah.
practical like that. I'm sort of like, there are some people that I just know when I, speak to them for a while that they are going to be able to perceive the things easily. And I think that is important in folk necromancy because there is something about those, your big rituals and your sort of conjurings from grimoires and stuff that does, if you dedicate yourself to it enough, can give experiences to people that otherwise would not have had experiences.
Mhm,
Whereas folk necromancy, it definitely will give you a lift if you haven't already had those experiences, but it's something that you have to work on at a different level. It's not like acquiring all the goat skins and the right
mhm,
type of ritual dagger and everything like that, but
mhm,
it does still require work. And I think that if you are not the kind of person who's naturally been hearing chattering voices and, you know, perceiving the spirit of someone around after they've died, you still can use this material to improve that contact. But I suppose that you've got to really think about why you want to do that and how hard you're willing to work to do that.
mhm,
Um, that's what I would say about that. Yeah, I
mhm,
think there is more caution that, on your question of caution, I think there is more caution necessary for people who haven't naturally had these experiences before, simply
mm.
because they don't know how they'll react when it really starts happening.
Right.
Mm.
It can feel very destabilizing to have those sorts of spiritual experiences if you're not accustomed to them, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. I don't think this stuff is hurtful. I believe life and death naturally live close together. I don't think that you're letting in some sort of, bad energy or anything like that. It's a fertile energy because life thrives off death. Everything has to have some kind of rot in its roots before it
Mhm,
grows. Um, and I don't believe that you can keep those realms apart anyway. I think they're always
mhm,
interlocked. But the difference is when you're training to try to have a necromantic experience, you're enhancing your awareness of that interlocking. So,
right.
I guess it just depends how ready you are for it and how much you're willing to work on them.
Absolutely. Do you only work necromancy in the graveyard, or are there other spaces that are um, conducive to this work?
No to the graveyard and yes to the conducive. Going to graveyards is important to, especially for obtaining links to people that you don't have some kind of relic for. If you have the relics, such as the physical items that were very intimately used, like jewelry or even hair, which is wonderful, of a deceased person from your family, for instance, you might not even need to go to the grave. but people go to graves to collect grave dirt, to do more intense procedures like grave lying, like actually like lying on the grave of the person and going into a meditative state. Um, but the bulk of the work happens at home. The bulk of the work happens in front of the shrine of the dead that you've set up at home where you make your regular offerings. So
Mhm.
yeah, it's not reliant on graveyards.
Okay. Switching gears a little bit, I admit I'm a little bit enamored with the idea of your homesteading community. And I, my husband and I kind of joke because I've told him just a little bit about it, and I've always secretly in my mind had this kind of secret contingency plan if everything goes wrong in my life. Like, well, at least I can go live with Lee in Tasmania. Even though I, of course, haven't cleared this with you yet, but I just so respect the community you're creating out there. And I was wondering if you would mind sharing a little bit about it, and does it lend itself well to these practices?
Um, yeah, I think that the answer is probably that there is up and downsides to being in a community with this sort of thing. I mean, obviously, we set it up with the idea that it would be a magical community where everyone that lived here, we don't have to hide what we do.
Hmm.
We've got a very private area for practice, out in the forest and everything, which is ideal. But of course, the other aspects of being on a rural property, such as, roosters making a noise and dogs making a noise, and um, the state that I go into when I commune with my familiar spirits is quite meditative, and sometimes the hubbub of being in a community can sometimes present its own difficulties. But really, in the scheme of things, it's the best place for this kind of work and a kind of ideal because I'm always able to return to my shrine that I work with, on a regular basis. I don't have to be
Mm,
out of the home as often as I was
mhm.
before the homesteading began. And
Okay.
that seems to work well. Like some of the spirits that you work with, um, like, um, sort of routine. They get quite
Mhm.
disturbed if their shrine gets moved too much, or if I don't give them their offering at the same time of day, and things like that. So in
Okay.
that regard, it's kind of ideal, but with challenges,
Mhm. It sounds
like
like
everything in
a
life.
lovely place. Yeah. Mhm.
Yeah, it certainly is. We've been very blessed.
Yeah. We've come through quite a crazy and frankly tragic year. At the time of filming, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. Um, how has this influenced your necromantic work? I know a big reason why you originally offered this course was to meet the needs of the community during difficult times, which I find really admirable. Have you noticed any differences in your practices during this time? And have you had to make any adjustments to bear the heaviness of the global community?
Um, well, for a start, we've been very lucky down here in Tasmania.
Mm.
Like we're on 0 cases on the island, and we have a moat, so we can sort of keep it that way to a degree until economic hardship begins to wear away at us.
Mm,
We're a tourist based place, so yeah, there's
mhm.
that problem. But yeah, we don't have the same degree of stress and urgency about it that a lot of other places do. And, obviously I'm touching wood right here because I don't want the fates to think we're gloating.
Yeah,
Um,
I'll touch
never.
wood for you on that one. Yeah.
Thank you. Um, but yeah, it hasn't changed our lives as much as it would have for a lot of other people. And I guess that was part of why I wanted to extend some of the things that I have found very helpful in life when it comes to facing uncertainty and death and change and grief and everything like that, because I felt, the relative safety of my position allowed
Mm.
me to focus on that a bit. Whereas I think if we were on extreme lockdown and, getting tested all the time and going through that, I might not have had the bandwidth to offer that.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think, psychologically for everyone, regardless of where we're situated in the world, it does bring up an awareness of death and disease,
Mhm.
in a way that's different to pre-pandemic. But yeah, our impact here has not been huge at a physical level.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, I'm really grateful that you've been able to, extend some kindness and aid during these times from your place of being maybe a little more resourced than a lot of us are who have been very extremely affected by the pandemic. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I guess we can all do what we can, and I don't have a lot of the skills that other people do that are on the front line as nurses and everything like that. I've just got my weird little magic in the woods thing to offer.
Mm. Well, it's a lovely gift nevertheless. um, have you ever thought about writing a book about necromancy?
I have. At the moment, I'm sort of pouring a lot of the thoughts that I had played with about writing a book on necromancy into the course.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe over time, I might grow that material into something bigger. But
Mm.
it's been really valuable to me to road test it on a wide variety of people in the course, because,
Hmm.
as I said before, people's responses and reactions can be very diverse. And,
Hmm.
some people have had amazingly transformative experiences. Other people have had, the willies put up them a little bit, and that's all good information in a way for me when deciding what I would write if I was going to write that book, I think.
Yeah. Oh, well,
Learning
that's
from it.
exciting. I'm a huge fan of your work, and I
Thank you.
that's a your work is what drew me to you and asking you to offer courses through the school. So uh, I actually I have your three books on direct practice with me that I wanted to show everyone. And this is your most recent one, Sounds of Infinity, and then Standing and Not Falling. And finally, this one, this is the one that really spoke to my heart when I first started seriously looking at traditional witchcraft. And this is A Deed Without a Name.
Mm,
And in it, I found some information that was very hard to find anywhere else. And I've always been very grateful to you for the work you put out into the world and for providing information that isn't readily available.
mm. Um,
What's your favorite book that you've written? And I know you've written a number of
mm,
fiction,
oh.
fictional books too.
Yeah. I do prefer writing fiction for myself,
Mhm,
like in my own enjoyment, but in terms of
mhm,
the impact on other people, I would say that probably Standing and Not Falling would be my favorite. It's
mm,
probably the least poetic of anything that I've written, very practical and down to earth. But
mhm,
after A Deed Without a Name, a lot of people wrote to me and said that, it had definitely spoken to them and given them some direction. But a lot of people wanted to know more practical things. They wanted to know,
mhm,
how do you get started to have those experiences? And it was like there wasn't enough of the beginners sort of side of it in there.
mhm.
And especially in the traditional witchcraft genre, there isn't seemingly as much of that. So I wrote
Oh
that
yeah,
book.
I would agree. Mhm,
Yeah, it's a bit of a hole there, but I started writing Standing and Not Falling with the idea that it would fill that gap, and then realized that it could actually be for any form of occultist, that it
mhm,
didn't have to just be aimed at traditional witches. It could actually be used by anyone. And I guess it's my favorite because I think I've put a lot of things in there that would have been really helpful to have known before I fell into various pitfalls and, bad
Mhm.
influences and things that weren't great for me. So I kind of
Yeah,
hope it does that to other people.
absolutely. I think that's a passion that you and I have shared since we first started working together at the school. Just wanting to help demystify things a little bit. I mean, you can never fully demystify this path, and indeed you wouldn't want to because that's part of the draw, but yet helping people avoid some of the pitfalls and providing some reliable and safer instructions for people. So,
Mm,
mhm,
yeah, it's a bit of a mental detox, really, I
mhm,
suppose.
yeah. In a nutshell, what is your best advice to the seeker more at the beginning of their journey on the crooked path?
Um, I suppose I would say, like, I'm assuming someone who's going on that journey has had some experience or something which has made them feel like they could be a witch. Um, if that is the case, then I would say to always trust that. Like, come back to what your initial experience was and trust it above what anybody tells you. Like, don't accept,
Mhm,
people who are speaking in imperatives all the time and saying this is how it is and everything like that if it doesn't fit with your fundamental vision, because you'll come full circle back to that anyway. You'll come back with more experience, and it might be helpful to follow what other people have suggested, but your journey will never be exactly the same as theirs, and you've got to trust your own vision at some point. I
mhm,
think everybody, who is going to continue walking down that crooked path has got to cross certain bridges alone, even if you are in
mhm.
community like I am.
Right.
You're always going to be alone during certain trials and tests that you'll face, and there's nobody that knows better than your own firsthand experience. Um,
Mhm,
you might need that qualified in certain ways at certain times, and it really is a terribly hard juggle to work out how much someone is qualifying your experience in a way which is going to help you and how much they are kind of almost trying to take from you the virtue of your own experience and channel it into their stream of thinking and practicing. And I think we're always on that fence, like always sort of like, straddling that hedge between the
mm,
importance of physical teachers. And I really do believe in the importance of them. I
mhm,
believe that it just helps to tame some of the egotistical impulses that can come through in some people with magic
mhm,
to have actually had to listen to someone for a period of time. But there,
mhm,
yeah, you've got to be careful, I guess, of making sure that you listen, but also maintain the dignity of your inner voice.
mhm. That is beautifully spoken and very true. Absolutely. I like that you mentioned ego because I feel like something in our community at large is a lack of focus on maybe personal and character development, which I
Mm.
feel
Yeah.
is something that is much more embraced in certain traditions that are more of a religious nature.
Mm. I think that's why I do think that there is a benefit in initiatory traditions if they're good. It's as I say
Mhm.
once again, it's always this like, trying to balance out the good that you get from something. Because being in a situation where you have elders, where you have people who you have to be quiet for a second and actually listen and stop just running your mouth, it
Mhm.
does hone your personality in a way that prevents you becoming, intolerable. Because I think
Yeah.
there really are plenty of people in the occult community, because there is no fundamental check and balance on being able to test the veracity of people's claims. people whose egos run riot can have a field day in this area. And that's the main reason that I continue to stick to the label traditional craft after all this time, because I have not seen anything else, at least in magic circles, other than initiatory houses and teachers that help to check the ego.
Hmm. It's really important, and I hope it becomes a greater topic of conversation in the wider occult community.
Hmm. I mean, I doubt it was a problem in the past when people were born into these natural, intergenerational situations where they had to, fetch hot drinks for their elders and stuff like that. But these days, it is something we do have to become self-conscious about, I think.
Hmm. Absolutely. But yeah, I mean, in familial traditions, there's this depth of relationship and a organicness of the growth that happens. It's not just the spiritual practices being imparted to someone. It's the whole, how do I live as a person in the world, being imparted by family. And
Mm.
I think,
And it does
mhm,
take a long time to sort of substitute that in a witch house where you are looking at seeing each other as family, where you're looking at adoption. It's a very big process, and I don't think it, gets enough airtime. The importance of having some kind of slow burn approach to magic. I'm very
mhm,
much about the slow burn.
mhm, I agree. So similarly to my, asking advice for the more beginning practitioner, I was curious if you have any particular advice for a more advanced practitioner. Um, what in your tradition, could you share a little bit about the typical path of development for the practitioner?
Yeah, sure. Well, you have a teacher, like an in-person, in the flesh teacher, that you're sort of apprenticed to, for want of a better term, for a year and a day, in the way that you often hear in other traditions. But I wouldn't say that the bulk of the learning even takes place during that time. I think that is a time where the two people are trying to work out if it's a good fit more than anything, because after that, there's more time involved.
Hmm.
There's years involved, of learning from the whole coven, really, like in different specialities and things like that.
Hmm.
And I think that this dovetails quite well with what we were talking about ego before. That, I think that has a kind of process of honing the person, but also accustoming them to the customs and the different ways of doing things. That we have.
Hmm.
You know, without that time, you wouldn't really get that. And but this all being said, no teacher ever takes a student to any kind of adepthood. I think you only can really open the door, and you can share cultural customs and practices and everything. And if it works out, if that person becomes like a family member, then something strange starts to happen where there is like the coven develops its own sort of alembic, like alchemic thing, where people in the group catalyze development in other people in the group, and
Hmm.
it develops a life of its own.
Hmm. I love that. Yeah. I I admit I have been very curious as my path has been largely much more solitary, and I love this emphasis on community and learning from a group, and um, being able to live your entire life authentically with no apologies, and having your main daily community be fellow practitioners.
Hmm. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to achieve. It's something we've always wanted in terms of, the physical community. Um, and I think it's really important that you've known each other for years and years and years and years.
Mhm,
Like I would say, you're at that point where what's mine is yours, like
mhm,
before you go into something like that. Because if everyone's still thinking as an individualist, which our society gets us to do. I mean, I'm not saying like people can't have their own personal possessions or anything, but just that like the thriving and the going forward of what we need as a group is something that's
mhm.
become naturally established rather than forced. Like you can't force people to see each other as kin. You need time. And over time, you get to the point where you can do something like this, but even then it's only on a smaller scale. I think if you tried to do it with 10 people or something, it would become more complex.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much, Lee, for taking the time today and sharing with us. And thank you, everyone who has tuned in. And we appreciate you, and we hope that you liked our interview. And if you did, please give us a like and share us, comment. We would love to hear from you, and we do hope you'll join us for Lee's phenomenal upcoming course, The Great Initiator, offered through the Blackthorne School. And we will provide a link along with this interview. Thank you so much, Lee.
Thank you, Kalan.
Take care.